In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about imperial and industrial rivalries that existed during 1870 to 1914. Now, for the half century before 1870, imperialism was unfashionable, or at least a low priority for the great states of Europe. Now, liberalism seemed to argue against imperialism. Following Adam Smith and American independence, most European statesmen decided that they could profit from an overseas market or source of raw materials without the trouble and expense of governing or defending it. Now, following the French Revolution and the rise of reform movements in Britain and elsewhere, it was difficult to justify imperialistic domination of other peoples. Now, by 1830, Spain and Portugal had lost their overseas empires to independence movements, and France had lost most of its colonial empire as a result of the 7 Years' War and the Congress of Vienna. Russia retained a vast empire in Eurasia, but sold Alaska to the United States. Now, only the Dutch and British retained large overseas empires. The Dutch retained Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and New Guinea, and the British retained Canada, Cape Colony, South Africa, and a presence in India and Australia. Only the United States, driven by the idea of manifest destiny, continued to expand its empire westward from 1815 to 1870. Now, in Europe, nationalism further discredited the idea of empire in Europe. Now, the revival of the empire after 1870 had 5 causes. The first, its economic reasons were paramount. It's true that the old mercantilist ideas of such men as Colbert had been exploded by Adam Smith, but that did nothing to stop individual Europeans from trying their luck abroad. In fact, the Smithian laissez-faire doctrine of free trade encouraged it. Now, these men rarely understood fully the cultures of foreign peoples and seemed to have assumed that Western attitudes and Smith's natural economic laws prevailed everywhere. They expected locals to allow them to buy and sell with minimal interference from local rulers or religious authorities, and they were often perceived by locals as ignorant, arrogant, and totally insensitive to native power structures or customs. 2 examples serve to highlight this insensitivity. In the late 17th century, the British began importing tons of Chinese tea, but they had nothing of comparable value to sell to the Chinese, resulting in a trade imbalance. The one exception was opium, grown cheaply by the British in India, although outlawed in China. The resultant smuggling trade reversed the imbalance of trade for Britain, but increased the problem of addiction for China. Now, in March of 1839, Chinese officials confiscated British opium in the docks, leading to the First Opium War. In India, the British East India Company had taken advantage of Indian disunity to make favorable treaties with local rulers, and by 1850, the company had conquered or dominated most of the subcontinent and retained the largest army in India. Beginning in 1853, the British failed to address a rumor in the Indian army that the tips of cartridges that had to be bitten off in order to fire them from the new Lee Enfield rifles were greased with pig or cow fat. In May of 1857, the Indian Army rebelled. Hundreds of British soldiers and civilians were massacred. As a result of the events like this, European governments increasingly stepped in, not because they wanted colonies, but to protect trade. For example, the British and French fought China in 2 opium wars from 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860. In order to force the Chinese into free trade. In India, the British dissolved the ancient Mughal Empire and assumed control after the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Now, using similar justifications, the British acquired Singapore and Egypt. The second justification was that military considerations led to or were thought to justify empire. Once a nation acquired a colony or trade route, it had to be protected. For example, the British acquired Cape Colony and a series of islands in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean to protect its route in India. Once the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the British expanded into Egypt for the same reason. Now, this led to interests in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, explaining the British interest in Somalia and South Arabia in 1884, and their acquisition of Palestine and Iraq in the 1920s. The viability of Egypt, of course, depended on the Nile. The British began to worry about this route as the Germans moved into East Africa in the 1880s, thus they took Kenya in 1886 and the Sudan in 1898. They continued to protect Cape Colony, also known as South Africa, especially after the discovery of diamonds there. And similarly, the French conquered most of West Africa to protect Algeria. The third reason for imperialism involved racism, often backed by religion. In the medieval and early modern periods, Christians thought that they were the only ones with the knowledge of God and the path to salvation, implying a duty to spread that message. In the 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries preached Roman Catholicism to Central and South American Indians. In the 17th century, French missionaries did the same in Canada and the Great Lakes region. Simultaneously, Catholic missionaries accompanied traders to China, Japan, India, and most of Africa. Beginning in the 18th century, Protestant churches in Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany began to send missionaries to Africa as well. In the 19th century, Catholic, French, and Belgian missionaries went to West Central Africa. Now, all these missions built churches, hospitals, and schools and introduced native peoples to Western religion, medicine, technology, and commerce. Now, these missions also behaved arrogantly toward native cultures and traditions, sometimes forcing conversions, destroying native shrines, and undermining native beliefs. 19th century science was widely thought to be another one of these features of Western life that demonstrated the superiority of European culture. Now, as we've already seen in previous lectures, Darwin's theory of natural selection and its corollary, the survival of the fittest, were used by social Darwinists to justify the European class system and exploitation of Africans, Asians, and others. The relatively new science of anthropology was also used to justify European superiority by asserting that the physical characteristics of Europeans were associated with refined blood and civilized behavior. The fourth great cause for the imperial land grab was popularity. People of all ranks liked the idea of having an empire. Though it denied the nationalism of others, it fit the notion of one's own country's superiority. And finally, failing all else by the 1880s, the great powers of Europe were acquiring colonies because they could, and because national prestige was measured by the extent of a nation's overseas empires, and because they did not want to be left out. So, how far did the great European powers extend their dominion? Now, we've seen how, in order to protect its route to India, the British moved first into South Africa and the Indian Ocean, and then northern and eastern Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and by 1900, the British Empire included 1/4 of the world's landmass and 1/5 of the world's population. All these places supplied raw materials for the juggernaut of British industry, and they all provided bases for and were guarded by the Royal Navy. In addition, the British invested heavily in Japan, China, Turkey, the United States, and Central and South America. Wealthy Britons made the world their playground, traveling as explorers, scientists, tourists, and expatriates. And they gave the world new words like Raj and Cook's Tour and Posh, and sports like lawn tennis and rugby, football, squash, and cricket. Now, France resurrected its empire in the 1830s, conquering much of northern and western Africa, but Britain's colonies were far more lucrative. In a strange example of French ambition, Napoleon III attempted and failed to establish a puppet French regime in Mexico under Archduke Maximilian of Austria. The French also acquired Asian and Pacific holdings. Germany only established its empire in East Africa after unification in 1871. Italy, also a late starter, concentrated almost totally in the poorest parts of Africa. Finally, Belgium's King Leopold II was given control of the Belgian Congo and its lucrative rubber trade at the Congress of Berlin in 1884. The Belgian Congo was perhaps the most brutal of the imperialistic regimes. The native population was exploited ruthlessly at a cost of 5 to 10 million livres. Now, setting aside for a moment the question of whether Europeans had any right to be there, we're going to survey the effects of imperialism. Now, an optimist would argue that European imperialists brought European religion and philosophy, science and medicine, technology and economic development, and the rule of law. Now, in contrast, a pessimist would point out a legacy of bigotry and cultural insensitivity, economic exploitation, pollution, and the destruction of natural resources and the natural environment. Now, by their inference, Europeans ensured that native cultures missed out on 200 years of their own growth and interaction. Now, although Europeans certainly brought many good things, one would be hard-pressed to argue that most of them, the missionaries apart, did so for altruistic reasons. The infrastructure of Europeans established was designed for extraction of raw materials and not local development. And further, the beneficiaries of this extraction were overwhelmingly European. Tribalism and corruption were ways for native peoples to resist and cope, and have left their own bitter legacy of bloodshed and poverty in Africa to this day. These facts do not absolve native peoples completely of their own demise. Local African and Indian rulers, having no sense of nationalism, often engaged in their own brutal tribal warfare and slavery, and they cooperated with Europeans for their own particular advantage. So, what was the significance of imperialism for World War I, as we're going to be arriving soon? European imperialism inspired rivalries and conflicts among the nations that would not have otherwise shared borders nor had reasons to clash. During the 1870s and 1880s, for example, the British and French clashed constantly along the Gold Coast of the Sudan. In the 1890s, Germany encouraged a revolt of the Dutch Boer settler population against British rule in South Africa. In the Middle East, a crumbling Ottoman Empire left a vacuum into which the great West powers of Europe wanted to insert themselves. Russia, hoping to expand south, fought the Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 against Britain, France, Piedmont, Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire. Russia's advance into the Far East led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The scramble for native bases in the Pacific led to disputes over the Samoan Islands. And in 1898 to 99, the United States dramatically raised its Pacific presence by taking the Philippines from Spain, and this would later lead to tensions with Japan. Now, all these conflicts added to the reasons that European powers had for suspicion of and hostility toward their neighbors. Imperial addiction would be the first of the long-term causes of the Great War. All right, so now we're going to talk about industrial rivalry. So we talked about imperial rivalry, and now we're going to look at the industry behind it. Now, once again, the period from 1870 to 1914, during which Europe was adjusting to the rise of Germany and acquiring new territories overseas, also coincided with what some historians have called the Second Industrial Revolution. This period began to exploit new sources of fuel and energy, including oil and electricity. Fuel would power ships and automobiles, and energy made possible telegraphy by mid-century, the telephone in 1876, a raft of inventions by Thomas Edison, including the phonograph, the electric light, and the motion picture camera, and the perfection of the use of radio waves by Guglielmo Marconi in 1895. Now, the manufacture and marketing of these inventions were facilitated by ever greater amounts of liquid capital. This period saw the rise of great multinational corporations such as Standard Oil, Woolworths, Armstrong Whitworth, Singer, and even Westinghouse. Total productivity tripled during this period. But in the short run, that increase did not translate into economic stability. Beginning with a massive worldwide depression in 1873, the period saw periodic boom and bust cycles, mainly due to overproduction. And during gluts, prices and wages fell, resulting in increased unemployment and bitter strikes. For the most part, however, the developments of the Second Industrial Revolution made people's lives better. Agriculture was revolutionized by mechanical reapers and threshers and refrigeration. Rail transport enabled fresh food to be brought to the cities, and by 1850, famine was a thing of the past in developed countries. Now, as we've seen, advances in medicine and hygiene and sanitation also made inroads into cholera, tuberculosis, smallpox, typhus, and typhoid, leading to longer lifespans. During the 19th century, the population of Europe grew from 190 million to 423 million. Millions of Europeans migrants swelled the populations of North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. In Europe, millions moved to the cities seeking economic opportunities. So what was life like for the new urban dwellers? The mid-19th century was a great rebuilding of the capital cities of Europe. These cities were now filled with parks and green space, along with wider streets, very different from the cities we saw developed in the first Industrial Revolution. Great buildings were erected, sometimes as with the government ministries built in London and Berlin, to express the power of the state. And the 19th century was also a great age for the construction of public museums, opera houses, and department stores. Streetlights enhanced the safety of the urban population and the urban environment, and perhaps even more important was modern plumbing. European cities began to tackle sewage disposal, and water filtration was seen as a civic responsibility. And by the end of the century, running water in taps, backyard outhouses, and flush toilets in the homes of the wealthy were commonplace. Also, by the end of the century, Western Europe was crisscrossed with rail lines, making it possible to ship goods long distance and travel into the country. Now, this new technology resulted in the growth of bureaucracy. It was now possible for governments to monitor, police, and educate the masses. The 19th century saw the first systematic censuses in Britain, France, the United States, and all of which facilitated government planning. Income tax for non-military purposes were first adopted in the mid-19th century. Now, governments contributed to an increasing professionalization of society by establishing state schools. In 1847, Piedmont Sardinia established a state education system, which it extended to Italy in 1861. And during the period from 1879 to 1881, the French Minister of Education began a reform program that included free compulsory secular and co-educational schools for each village. And in Britain, the Education Act of 1870 mandated the creation of public schools. At the same time, British economic growth was slowing down. Britain's gross national product, or GNP, from 1820 to 1850 grew 3.5%, and during the period from 1870 to 1940 by only 2.2%. In 1870, Britain produced half of the world's steel. By 1880, Britain produced 1/3, and by 1902, only 1/7. In 1870, Britain controlled 41% of the world's trade, and by 1940, only 30%. Now, Britain began to slow down just as industrial Germany and the United States were growing by leaps and bounds. The GNPs of Germany and the United States increased nearly 5% a year during this time period. Germany surpassed Britain in steel production in 1893. And by 1914, it was making twice as much. By 1914, Germany and the United States handled nearly as much trade as the British. And finally, most of the life-changing inventions noted earlier in this lecture were American. This apparent shift in Britain's economic position versus the rest of the world, especially Germany's, helps to explain some of the international tensions described in the previous lecture. Britain began to decline relative to Germany and the United States, in part because other countries were bound to catch up sometime. But the British also made some crucial errors. British science education lagged behind Germany, especially in engineering. British factory owners often failed to reinvest in their firms to keep their factories and research and development operations up to date. And they also relied too much on the British Empire as a protected market where they could always dump inferior, obsolete products. And they grew overextended them in the military and began to pour more and more of their research, national capital, and energy into an arms race, first with France and then after 1871 with Germany. Now, these arms races were another long-term cause of the Great War. Historians debate whether arms races are necessarily causes for war, but building an arsenal does seem to make more possible and more thinkable. Now, an arms race also implies a certain amount of provocation, almost forcing competitors to see each other as hostile and to begin to cast about for allies. Now, this is why Bismarck, in particular, was adamant that Germany should never build a large navy, precisely because it would upset the British and cause them to look for support. Britain was a naval power, whose traditional rival was France. The British had been supreme at sea since Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805, and throughout the 19th century, Britain had pursued a policy of splendid isolation towards Europe, concentrating on its empire and building a royal navy that was bigger than any two navies combined. Germany was a land power, whose traditional rivals were France and Russia. Prussia, then Germany, had traditionally poured wealth into the army. In the 1890s, a new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, dismissed Bismarck and began to build a navy. This action naturally alarmed the British, who wondered why a land power in Central Europe needed warships. In 1906, the British produced a new, faster, heavier gunned battleship called the HMS Dreadnought, and when the Germans responded in kind, the naval race escalated to a new level. Dreadnought-type battleships became the ICBMs of their day. National wealth and prestige were measured in the number of dreadnoughts a nation had. Now, by 1914, the British had built 21 dreadnought battleships to form the Grand Fleet. The Germans had built 14, forming the backbone of the High Seas Fleet. Both navies now trained incessantly for what the Germans referred to as Der Tag, a second Trafalgar in which one side or the other would establish naval supremacy once and for all. In fact, by 1914, the great powers were stockpiling not just battleships for ammunition, artillery, rifles, machine guns, and men to build vast armies. Instead, or indeed, by the 20th century, as the 20th century dawned, it began to seem inevitable that after nearly a century of peace, Europe would once again explode into war. The only hope to prevent the explosion and preserve the peace in Europe was a system of alliances originally established by Otto von Bismarck for this very purpose. Now, thanks to the machinations of the Kaiser, that alliance system would instead provide the final spark necessary to light the fuse.